Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday Wisdom today. It'll be on trauma, scarcity, and employment. Our Wednesday Wisdom is a public webinar focused on delivering relevant information to support business connectivity and sustainability in our region. Each session features business and subject matter experts and the opportunity for a Q&A. Before we get into the event, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. The event is currently being live streamed on Facebook. We had some issues with that, but now it's working. We will record this webinar and have it on our YouTube page, allowing you to share it with your colleagues or anyone that you feel will benefit from this information. While we're recording, we ask attendees to remain on mute. We'll have a portion for the Q&A at the end. If you're watching on Facebook and have a question, we do have team members monitoring that. So feel free to place your questions in the comment section, and we will ask of our presenter. Today's topic is, as I mentioned, will be featured on trauma, scarcity, and employment. Attendees will get an overview on how responses to trauma and scarcity can manifest at work, review the principles of trauma-informed care, and discuss the ways in which employers can build awareness, respond appropriately to trauma, and avoid re-traumatizing workers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Warland. Chris has over 20 years of experience in the field of workforce development, specializing in programmatic and system-level employment interventions for people facing barriers to employment, such as homelessness and prior incarceration. He has worked across the country as a trainer, consultant, and subject matter expert from community-based organizations, national organizations, municipal and state and government, and federal agencies. His area of expertise include transitional and subsidized employment, public systems coordination, and embedding employment programs within community violence interventions. Much of Chris' work has been focused on making workforce initiatives and employment opportunities more accommodating for people who have experienced trauma through program designs, system change, and policy advocacy. Chris holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in social service administration from the University of Chicago. Chris is currently in Chicago and travels to NEPA often with his work with the McGowan Foundation and RISE. Chris, I do have one question before you start. NEPA Sure. Pizza or Chicago pizza?
All right. Well, that is a tricky question. The last time I was in NEPA, I did go to Old Forge and have some of the pizza capital of the world pizza, and I thought it was pretty good. Although, in my opinion, Chicago pizza, still my favorite. However, not the deep dish. Any true Chicagoan will tell you they prefer the thin style, tavern style Chicago pizza. So that's my favorite still.
Well, awesome. Thanks for that little pointer too. If I'm ever in Chicago, I'll definitely think of that. Thank you.
All right. So shall we get started?
Yes, take it away.
All right, thanks. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Once again, I'm Chris Warland. I'm the Workforce Development Program Director with the William G. McGowan Fund. I am located in Chicago, although I do visit the Northeastern Pennsylvania region pretty frequently, probably about once a month. I was just out there earlier this month, and that's when I had some of the NEPA style pizza. Just a little bit about me. My work, once again, has really been focused on helping to ensure success in the labor market for people who have had challenges connecting with work. That work has led me to this topic of how the experience of trauma can affect someone's success in the workplace. I think it's a really big issue. I think it's an issue that doesn't get enough recognition in the field of workforce development, although that is changing. And I think that there are some really helpful, pieces of knowledge that employers can use in order to better support the productivity and well-being of their workers through a little bit of trauma awareness. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about scarcity. And scarcity just means not having enough of something that you need. In the context of economics and workforce development, that often means scarcity of money. But it can also mean other kinds of scarcity as well. The research that I'm going to talk about really briefly today um, isn't just about scarcity of money. It also applies to other forms of scarcity, including scarcity of time for people who are really busy or overscheduled and don't have enough time to get everything done. Some of these same phenomena will happen in your life if you're short on time. If you are experiencing loneliness and scarcity of human interaction and human contact, some of these principles apply as well. So if you're experiencing scarcity of food, both people who are experiencing hunger and people who are dieting, will experience some of these things as well. So all of these forms of scarcity are interrelated, according to the research that I'm going to cite today. But we are primarily going to be talking about scarcity of money, scarcity of resources, and how that affects people's ability to plan and make decisions and succeed economically. So everything that I'm going to be talking about for this next slide comes from a book called Scarcity, which I highly recommend if you have a little bit of extra time to do some reading. The book Scarcity by Mullainathan and Shafir is just a really, really great and enlightening book, really opened my eyes. And also has really helped to inform the employment programming that the McGowan Fund is supporting in Northeastern Pennsylvania. So when someone is experiencing scarcity, when they don't have enough of something that they really need, that really impacts their cognitive capacity. It can really affect a person's ability to perform some really basic, important cognitive tasks like making plans, initiating plans, following through on activities. And that's because when you are experiencing a scarcity of something, it really inhibits your ability to focus on anything other than that one thing that is your most immediate need. And the authors of Scarcity refer to that as tunneling. You can get tunnel vision on the one thing that you really, really need at that moment, to the detriment of everything else that you need to be paying attention to. So one example is, if you are short on cash and you don't think you're going to be able to make the rent this month, that kind of looming eviction and potential homelessness is going to require all of your mental energy and all of your attention, and you really won't be able to think about anything else. And there might be other really important things in your life that you need to take care of, and you won't be able to do them because you're so focused on that looming eviction because you can't pay rent. So that could mean things like meeting with your child's teacher at school. Very important, right? Really, really critical, important thing for your kids' education and development. But if the more immediate challenge is you're going to get evicted, you could very well blow off that meeting with your kid's teacher. And it's not because it's not important. It's not because you don't value it. It's just because there's something else happening at that moment that's commanding all of your attention. It's this tunneling that happens. So this affects what we call executive function or self-regulation skills, all the things that I mentioned before, the ability to initiate a task, the ability to remain focused on a task, the ability to complete a task, the ability to use, your working memory and your metacognition in order to, make plans and kind of see the big picture. One really interesting thing that I think came out of this book that you've probably already focused in on this slide is that if you are experiencing scarcity, it can actually temporarily lower your IQ score. I think this is a really important thing to understand. This was done through, really well-designed experiments. And there are a couple of experiments that I'll just touch on really briefly that illustrate this, which I think were really enlightening, that the authors used in the book Scarcity. One was they looked at a group of farmers in India, and they looked at their ability to kind of like perform cognitive tasks during the period right before their harvest, where they were really short on resources and experiencing a lot of scarcity, and the period right after harvest, where they were, flush with cash because they just sold their crops. So the exact same people, not different people, where you could maybe ascribe other causes to these differences in IQ scores. It was the same people before and after harvest. And what they found was that those IQ scores were actually impacted by 13 to 14 IQ points before and after harvest. So that's really huge. That's a really significant difference. And it's all because before the harvest, those farmers were experiencing scarcity, and it affected their ability to perform other kind of like cognitive tasks. Another thing that I think is really interesting to point out is that you don't even have to be experiencing scarcity in the moment in order for this to have an effect. There were other experiments that the researchers conducted where they just asked volunteers to imagine a scenario where they were experiencing scarcity. So they had a group come in and say, all right, before we do this test, we want you to imagine that you have a $100 expense that you have to meet, like an unexpected $100 expense, and then perform the task. And then they had another group come in and say, you have a $5,000 unexpected expense. Think about how you're going to address that, and then you're going to take this IQ test. And people who weren't even experiencing those things for real, they were just asked to imagine what would happen. The people that were asked to imagine a larger expense performed worse on these tests than the people who had a smaller expense. And so it's just really critical, especially when we're talking about low-income folks, people who are experiencing poverty, that the very experience of poverty can affect the kinds of skills people need in order to escape poverty. And that a lot of times what's happening when people are experiencing poverty is not because they don't have the necessary skills and knowledge and aptitude to lift themselves out of poverty. It's because the experience of poverty is creating this limited bandwidth. It's causing them tunnel vision and inhibiting their ability to make plans for the future. So before I move on, I'll just also point out that scarcity is a form of trauma. So we're going to talk about trauma in the next couple of slides, and just keep in mind that this experience of scarcity or poverty or deprivation is one form of trauma for folks. So trauma more broadly, I'm sure everybody has kind of a concept in their heads already of what trauma means, but I think it's helpful for us to kind of arrive at a common definition, because it's not just, some of the things you might immediately associate with trauma, like a single traumatic event. It can be, but it can be, chronic conditions or circumstances as well. So here's a pretty good definition of trauma that we have from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And there are a couple of things that I want to call out here. One is that it can be a traumatic event, like being a victim of a crime, or being a victim of violence, or the sudden loss of a loved one, or a bad car accident, or some other thing that's like a one-time event that's really traumatic. Yes, that is absolutely traumatic, but it can also be a series of events. It can be repeated abuse over a period of time, for example. And it can also be a set of circumstances. So that's where we get into things like poverty or homelessness. or long-term neglect as a form of chronic trauma. Other kinds of chronic trauma can include things like lifelong exposure to racial discrimination or other kinds of bias. That can be chronic trauma as well. And so it's important to think about kind of like the full spectrum of traumatic experiences. But what they all have in common is that they are harmful to the individual, that the individual experiences those events or circumstances as harmful, and that they have a lasting long-term effect on that person's well-being, whether it's their physical well-being, their emotional well-being, their spiritual well-being. The trauma always has this kind of long-term lasting impact on the individual. The other thing that I think is important to note is that trauma, the experience of trauma, is subjective. It is based on the experience of the individual and how the individual responds to it. So something that could be really traumatic for one person might be less traumatic for another person, but it is subjective and it's based on that individual experience. So if a person says, this is something that happened to me that was very traumatizing, then that's true based on their experience. And it's not up to anyone else to tell them, no, that wasn't traumatic because I went through the same thing and it didn't affect me the same way. We're all individuals, we're all different. And what's traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you, but we have to acknowledge that it's based on that person's experience. Another thing that's really important to note is that vicarious trauma is real. If you witness something traumatic happening to someone else, or you find out that it happened to someone that you're close with, or you work in a situation like if you're in an ER, if you're a medical professional in an emergency room and you witness trauma, or if you're a social worker and you're dealing with people who are experiencing poverty and homelessness and chronic trauma, that can have the same effect on you as well. So just good to know vicarious trauma is a real thing and it definitely affects people's lives in significant ways. So the whole point of our talk today is the employment experience of people who have been traumatized and what that looks like and what employers and other professionals can do in order to address this phenomenon of traumatic experiences manifesting at work. So what do we know about trauma and employment? A lot of what we know about trauma and employment comes from a series of studies based on what we call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So a lot of the evidence comes from what happens when people have experienced trauma as children, and then how that impacts them for the rest of their lives, including their adult lives. And those childhood traumas can be, all the things that we mentioned: the experience of poverty, the experience of discrimination, the experience of violence or witnessing violence, abuse, neglect, having an incarcerated parent. There's a really long list of these adverse childhood experiences. But what we found is that the more of those experiences someone's had, the worse their outcomes are later in life. And those outcomes are, really far-reaching and can include, someone's physical and mental health. For example, people's physical health outcomes are far worse if they've had more adverse childhood experiences than people who've had fewer of them. But we're talking here about work. And what we do know is that the employment outcomes for people who have multiple adverse childhood experiences are really, really poor compared to other folks. That it really impacts someone's ability to hold down a job and earn a good income and be a productive worker later in life. And we have also some evidence to support that, if you're experiencing trauma as an adult, that you're going to have similarly challenging outcomes when it comes to your employment experience. So we also know that both low-income workers and workers of color are at higher risk of experiencing these impacts of trauma in the workplace. And so it's particularly important to note if we're talking about people in low wage work or entry level work, of course, disproportionately represented, among workers of color, that we need to be particularly mindful of how trauma might impact people's work experiences. And then finally, we're not talking about a small minority of workers here. We're talking about most working age adults. And so if you're an employer and you're thinking, well, this is probably just like a small fraction of my overall workforce, that's not true, as far as we know from the best evidence. Over 60% of working age adults will self-report having had traumatic experiences. And that's probably an undercount, because a lot of people, when they self-report, they don't necessarily even recognize their own experiences as traumatic. And so it's probably higher than that, but definitely a large majority of people in the workforce have likely experienced traumatic events that could impact their workplace performance and their well-being. So when we talk about, kind of what our response should be, we're talking about a universal response, not a targeted response just for a small handful of workers here. So how does it show up? What are the signs and symptoms of somebody who's responding to trauma in a workplace setting? Seeming unmotivated. We talk a lot in the field of workforce development about people's motivation and whether or not somebody's motivated, and how to motivate people, and how to determine when somebody, is actually, unmotivated to work. I'm here to tell you that a lot of times what appears to be a lack of motivation quite often has another underlying cause. And often that underlying cause is the experience of trauma. So if somebody seems detached, one thing that happens when people have experienced trauma is they can dissociate, right? Which means they're kind of stepping back, almost stepping out of their bodies a little bit and seeming really detached and distant. And that experience of dissociation a lot of times can make it look like somebody's not motivated. It can also make it look like they're not paying attention to you, or that they're not following through on their tasks and assignments. And that could actually be a response to trauma. In addition to the possibility that someone could dissociate, somebody could also become hypersensitive, and that could lead to agitation or lashing out or responding disproportionately to situations, and feeling perhaps as if they're being treated unfairly or disrespected or targeted in some way, when in fact they're not. And so that kind of like overreaction and sensitivity and agitation can also be a symptom of somebody who's experienced trauma. And also, as we mentioned in the prior slide, people who experience trauma tend to have poor health outcomes and poor mental health outcomes, and that can result in more frequent physical illness, taking sick days, being absent for work, being late for work, etc. And so when you look at, and this was the kind of aha moment when the light bulb went off over my head as a workforce development professional, was when I was attending a training on trauma-informed care, and I saw these lists of traumatic responses, and I thought, those are the exact same things that'll get you fired from a job. And that kind of made me think, like, maybe a lot of really sort of like bad employment outcomes, like somebody quitting or getting fired from a job, could be the result of not an attitude problem or a lack of motivation, but instead the fact that somebody's responding to trauma in a way that hasn't been properly identified or responded to. And so I thought, what if we trained employers and other workforce development folks on how to identify and respond appropriately to trauma, maybe we could avoid some of these bad employment outcomes. Because when somebody quits or gets fired, as you know, it's not just bad for the worker, it's bad for the employer. And, those kinds of workplace separations and turnover can also mean lower productivity and higher costs for employers too. So it's in everybody's best interest to be able to effectively identify trauma in the workplace and respond to it in a way that can potentially salvage that employment relationship and lead to more productive, happier workers. Um, so, when somebody has experienced a lot of trauma, um, we wanted to know kind of how that experience shapes, how they show up at work. And so my team actually conducted a series of focus groups. And the focus group participants were actually highly traumatized individuals. This was part of a community violence prevention program that we were working with. And so we were conducting focus groups with participants in this community violence intervention. These were individuals who were all at incredibly high risk of being victims of community violence and also at very high risk of participating in community violence. Virtually all of them had been victims of violence themselves, shot, stabbed, beaten. A lot of them had history of incarceration. Virtually all of them had lost a loved one or a close friend to gun violence in their communities. So very traumatized individuals. And we talked to them about what they would want in a workplace situation. First and foremost, as you might expect, they all said they wanted to feel safe. They wanted a workplace where they felt physically safe and emotionally safe. And that was the number one response that we heard from folks, is that they just wanted a workplace where they felt safe. They also universally said that very clear communication and a lot of consistency about expectations was really, really important to them. We mentioned earlier, if somebody's responding to trauma, they might feel really sensitive to the possibility that they're being treated unfairly, or that they're being singled out, or that they're being disrespected. And by providing clarity and consistency in communication and policy, that can really help a lot toward preventing some of those situations where people feel as if they're being singled out or treated unfairly. There was a strong desire for mutual respect among workers and managers. And this means that, and they all said they're okay with being corrected. They're okay with receiving feedback about their performance. They're all okay with being told when they're not meeting expectations or when they need improvement, but they just wanted to be communicated to respectfully with regard to those things and not in front of other people. That was something that we heard a lot, is like, don't call me out on the shop floor in front of everyone. It's a lot better if we just have a private conversation where you tell me what I need to improve so that I can work on improving. And so this kind of atmosphere of respect was really, really critical for folks. They all really wanted an environment of positive teamwork, and a feeling like they could, get along peacefully and positively with their colleagues. And then they all really talked extensively about growth opportunities and the ability to learn and advance in their positions. So if you look at this list and then you think about the principles of trauma-informed care, which the principles of trauma-informed care were originally developed to be used in service settings. So healthcare, mental health care, substance use treatment, social service settings. These are principles that were developed to be implemented by social workers and counselors, right? But they might also have something to tell us about, a productive work environment. Because if you look at the principles of trauma-informed care, they really closely mirror what our traumatized focus group members told us about what they were looking for in a workplace. They were talking about safety. They were talking about transparency and clarity in policies. They were talking about being able to get along well with their peers and colleagues and have positive relationships with their peers. They talked about having, mutual respect and respectful feedback from supervisors. They talked about having a voice in what happens to them at work and being able to provide feedback. The other principle here that we see, cultural and historical and gender issues, that's just about understanding how somebody's identity and their kind of like intersecting identities need to be acknowledged as part of the trauma-informed care environment. So a lot of parallels here. If you look at this list, our focus group members told us these things without, they didn't know anything about the principles of trauma-informed care, but they were able to articulate them really well. And they were able to articulate them really well in the context of a workplace environment. So that should tell us something. Incidentally, if anyone here is familiar with the general principles of job quality, there's a lot of overlap here too. A lot of the kind of factors that we associate with a quality job, really overlap with what we've learned about trauma as well, including, the ability to have some voice or agency within your work, the ability to be collaborative, the ability to learn and grow and advance. Those are all job quality features too that we can think about. So whenever I see this kind of alignment, it gets me really excited because it makes me think that we're onto something and that we can apply in a practical way. So how might we implement some of these principles in a workplace setting? I'm sure that you've already started thinking about this as we've been talking, but a lot of these principles overlap really nicely with what a positive work environment looks like for folks. And here are just some ideas for how we might flesh that out. Safety, of course, means not just physical safety, although that's very important, but also an environment in which people feel like they're welcome and like they're being supported, and, just feeling as if they're in an environment where they're going to be treated with respect. Trustworthiness and transparency are a huge one when it comes to developing and communicating policies in the workplace. One example that I use all the time is if you have criteria for promotions and advancement within your organization, it's really important to make sure that those are clearly communicated so that workers know what they need to do in order to be successful and advance. And also that they understand when they see someone else getting promoted, what went into that decision, and to be able to say like, okay, well, I understand what the criteria were. It's not favoritism. They were able to meet these criteria for advancement, and that's why, they got the promotion and I didn't. And here's what I can do in order to be the next person to get that promotion. So that kind of clarity of policies and that kind of consistency and fairness is really, really important for people who experience trauma. And then, of course, there are a lot of ways to foster peer support in a workplace. And, some of these that I've seen work really well include having peer mentors assigned to new workers so that a new worker has a more experienced worker who can kind of show them the ropes and be their mentor through that experience. I've also seen a lot of positive stuff come out of daily affirmations where workers will get together in the morning and everyone will just say something nice or thank someone else on the team. So in the morning to sit around in a circle before you start work and say, I really appreciate Joe, yesterday when you finished your work and I wasn't done with mine yet and you pitched in and helped me out. I just want to thank you for that. That really made my day go better, and I appreciate you. Or, something along those lines where, we just acknowledge how other people are supporting us. So there are a lot of other ways that you can kind of build peer support into your workplace, but those are just a couple of examples. Collaboration and mutuality and this notion of empowerment and voice and choice in the workplace. We all know that very few workplaces function like a democracy, and that a lot of times people don't have a whole lot of input in how their jobs are performed, for various reasons. But it is really, really valuable whenever possible to give people the opportunity to provide feedback, and to be able to shape the way their work experience looks in ways that are appropriate. This, by the way, is also something that's been, tried out in a lot of different business contexts and found to be, beneficial for things like productivity and workplace safety and reducing the number of defects in products and all kinds of things like that. I always think about, the manufacturing practice that was first developed in Japan, in which any worker along an assembly line had the authority to stop the assembly line if they saw a quality control problem. So like that kind of agency in the workplace, and the ability to kind of make suggestions for changes and things like that, really, really valuable for all workers, including workers that have been traumatized. And then finally, it's also just really important to be mindful about how somebody's past experiences and their identity, whatever that may be, can impact, how they experience the workplace and what might re-traumatize them in the workplace. So if somebody has a history of experiencing discrimination, then, that could result in, some workplace scenarios affecting them more significantly than it might other workers. So just being aware of that, I think, is really important as well for employers. Some other things to keep in mind. So things that if you're an employer or you work regularly with employer partners, some things that are good to be aware of. One is that, and I have here, many entry-level jobs can cause trauma or re-traumatization. It's not just entry-level jobs. A lot of different jobs really have the potential to either put someone in a traumatic situation or to re-traumatize someone who's experienced trauma in the past. Some of that's unavoidable, right? Like I mentioned before, like people who are working in an emergency room, they're going to be witnessing traumatic events on a daily basis, and there's not all that much that you can do to kind of like modify that workplace to change that. It's just part of the job. Although there may be ways that you can shape policies or responses in ways that mitigate that experience of trauma. But all jobs potentially have the potential to either be traumatizing or re-traumatizing. So it's important to think about each position and what you can do in order to make it, less likely to traumatize someone. I often think about, for example, people who've experienced trauma a lot of times experience that as a loss of control. I no longer have control what's happening to me. And a lot of jobs that are really sort of rigidly structured don't give people a lot of control over their kind of like moment by moment work. And so if somebody's experienced trauma in the past, that kind of like highly controlled, regimented work environment might not be the best choice for that person. If there's a way to sort of like mitigate some of that through, maybe a little bit less regimentation or maybe a little bit less surveillance, so that people feel as if they've got a little bit more agency, that could be a good thing too. I already mentioned this next bullet point, which is that we're not talking about a small portion of your workforce. We're talking about the large majority of your workforce that could potentially be having these experiences. Also, as I mentioned, if somebody's responses to trauma could very likely result in them getting fired or getting disciplined or getting upset and quitting, that having a plan for a more trauma-aware workplace and more trauma-aware management practices very well could increase worker productivity and worker retention, and positively affect the bottom line as well. And then also for employers that have, kind of an active effort to improve their diversity, equity, and inclusion within their workforce, that a trauma awareness just goes hand in hand with those objectives. That by understanding how people from different backgrounds and different identities experience trauma and can be re-traumatized. If you have, diversity objectives within your organization, then trauma awareness is going to be an important part of supporting those efforts as well. A few other practical tips for employers in particular. Once again, when we talk about being a trauma-aware employer, we're not talking about singling people out for special treatment. We're not talking about having a subset of your workers that are going to be subject to different rules, or that you're going to go easy on one particular, subpopulation within your workforce. It's always better to have universal policies that are trauma aware and that are going to be friendly and supportive for people who've experienced trauma, rather than single people out. So we talk about this notion that of targeted universalism, right? Where you can have a policy that applies equally to everyone on your team or in your workplace, but that is also particularly beneficial for people who've had traumatic experiences in their past. It's also really important for frontline supervisors to get some training or information around trauma awareness, because that's where a lot of those potential friction points are going to occur, is between frontline workers and their frontline supervisors. And so in my former position, we actually developed a training for frontline supervisors in a manufacturing context that was really effective in helping those managers respond more appropriately, and to be able to identify when someone on their team might be responding to a traumatic experience, and to react differently in those situations in order to kind of like diffuse and be more productive and positive, and to salvage that relationship. And then once again, really being able to develop policies and practices within the workplace that prioritize that kind of clarity of communication, consistency of expectations, safety and transparency that we associate with trauma-informed care. And then just a few more things to recognize. This is something that I usually talk with about, with service providers like workforce development professionals or social workers, or, other people that are in sort of a service role. But I think it's good for employers to kind of take note of some of these ideas, right? One, and the first one here, information is often not enough. So what do we mean by that? A lot of times we think that by giving people information that we're going to impact their behavior positively. And all they need is to have better knowledge or information, and then they'll have the tools they need in order to change the way they react to situations. We all know that that's not true. I think probably most folks have had the experience where you might say, all right, I have an intellectual understanding that exercise is going to make me healthier. And armed with that information, why wouldn't I exercise every day? So we all have that factual knowledge that exercise is good for us. And yet how many of us actually are able to translate that knowledge into behavior change? It's not so easy, right? And so, and it's particularly challenging for somebody who's experienced trauma and scarcity and might have that kind of like tunneling effect where their cognitive bandwidth is limited and they're really only focused on their most immediate needs. And if somebody, once again, using that same example, if somebody's worried about rent this month and you say, I just need to give you the information about how important it is that you participate in your child's parent-teacher conferences, and then you'll go. Well, that information might already be known to that person. It's just that their circumstances are preventing them from following through and acting on that knowledge. So having knowledge is great, having information is great. It's not necessarily enough to affect somebody's response. We need to also change the environment and change the structures and circumstances in which they're functioning. Very closely related to that, the way somebody acts in the moment does not necessarily automatically reflect what they value and what they want to prioritize. Because once again, they could be focused on some other more immediate challenge or need that prevents them from, kind of like living out their priorities and values in their behavior. And this once again is particularly true if somebody's experiencing trauma or scarcity, that just because I don't do something doesn't mean that I don't value it. In the field of workforce development, I talk to folks all the time who say, I went through all this trouble to get someone a job interview and they didn't show up. They must not value the work that I've put in. They must not value employment and earned income in their life. That's probably not true. They probably place a really high value on employment and they probably do really value the work that you're doing for them, but there's something else happening in their life that's preventing them from following through on that value and priority. And that what we can do to respond to it, once again, is by actually making it easier for people to make the right choices, by reducing the friction and the cost of kind of taking the action that we want people to take. So in the perspective of helping people who've experienced trauma to get a job and access work, we talk about what can we do to make the job seeking process easier? What can we do to support someone so they're experiencing fewer barriers while they're searching for work? The same is true for once somebody is working, once they're employed. Like, what can we do to modify the environment that they're working in order to better ensure their success? Okay, so before we do the Q&A, because I know I'm gonna stop screen sharing for that, I just want to quickly talk to you about RISE. RISE is the program that the McGowan Fund is supporting. We are currently enrolling students in both Lackawanna and Luzerne counties, and it is an occupational skills training program that is specifically designed to address people's trauma and their experience of poverty and scarcity to help them succeed in occupational skills training with our academic partners. So I won't go into a whole lot of detail in this talk, but the website is right there, risenepa.org, and I would encourage you to check this out. So I guess I will stop my sharing now so that we can have a little bit of Q&A. So happy to use the next few minutes to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Chris. I'm actually going to take the questions offline for this. So the folks on Zoom could have the space to ask questions. So we'll stop the recording and stop the live stream on Facebook. I want to thank you for joining us here, sharing this very important information and just some steps and different things we can do to address trauma in the workforce and how we work with our employees every day. Thank you everyone who's watching for sharing your lunch hours with us. We did record this Wednesday Wisdom and will be available on Facebook and on YouTube pages for you to access in the future. Chris, would you mind sharing your contact information in case anybody wants to reach out to you with questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a final slide where I had my email address on it showing. So it's Warland, CWARLAND at McGowanFund.org. And so you're all welcome to reach out to me individually via email if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Chris. And also we welcome you to share this with your colleagues, friends, or everybody you feel will benefit from this information. If you have a topic that you think we should cover here on the Wednesday Wisdom, please email us at events@wyomingvalleychamber.org. And if you haven't done so already, please visit our website, check out the events that are coming up within our community, and sign up for a newsletter to stay up to date on all the happenings in our region. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Again, if you're on Zoom here, please hang tight for a Q&A.